Thanks, folks. Okay, did the Exodus happen? Picture to introduce. Because there's so much stuff out there, and indeed because it was the first one I came on, I'm only going to take very much a Jewish focus. Passover 2001, the rabbi named there informed his Los Angeles congregation that he didn't think the biblical account of Exodus was true. Now, taking the Jewish perspective on that thing, it was apparently revolutionary and is certainly caused an upheaval in the Jewish faith between, if you like, the liberal side and the more conservative side. This is perhaps the liberal views. One might be tempted to ask, what's the big deal? It's a good story, it gives enough morals, let's stick with it. So why get too upset about it? But for the conservative side, excising the Exodus from Judaism undercuts Judaism itself. Just a reminder, and I'll just focus here on the point here. The Ten Commandments, both in Exodus, recorded in Exodus 20, and also in Deuteronomy, both start off. The opening words are, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. That's the very foundation for the Ten Commandments. Everything else flows on from it. There's no Exodus, then you may as well throw away the lot. So there's the big contrast. And now let's look at the evidence. Oh, first of all, what am I going to do today? I just put the framework around it. We're going to look at the accounts of Exodus. We'll look at evidence, in summary, against the Exodus account. And yes, my apologies, I'm actually going to focus more on the evidence for Exodus. After all, this is an apologetics group, and so you would expect perhaps that we might emphasise more the focus on what we believe is the evidence for it. I will also discuss the Egyptian dynasties and Bible timing, because that's one of the areas that has, well, if you like, contradiction to what the Bible might say about it. Accounts of Exodus. Well, biblical text, you've got the Old Testament books, Kevin already mentioned. The books are largely from the old part of the New Testament, the Torah, but also the Psalms. And earlier, about a week ago, Kevin asked, well, okay, so it's only in the early books of the Bible. Do any of the prophets have anything to say, or didn't they even know about it? Maybe they didn't even think about it. Maybe they didn't regard it as happening. Well, fortunately, he gave me that challenge, and certainly if you turn to the book of Amos, you can certainly see 3 or 4 very specific pointing to the book of Exodus, the escape from Egypt. Amos, by reminder, says he preached during the reigns of Jeroboam II and also Uzziah. That's right, the guy that died, and Isaiah had his vision. So it appears at about 760 AD at least, which is when the BC rather, when we can plant Amos. He certainly knew all about the Exodus and believed in it because he was quoting it. Then indeed, if we pass on to the Christian side of things, we can look at Acts chapter 7. Stephen, guy with I was named after him, gives quite a detailed account when he defends himself before the Sanhedrin. Romans chapter 9, Paul talks about Pharaoh's heart being hardened as part of his illustration of God's sovereignty. And in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul reminds us again that we are we are to take account of the Exodus and what happened to remind us about how we conduct our faith. So yes, certainly, Old and New Testament, the folks talked about the Exodus. And then we have Hollywood. Got to remember Hollywood. Anyone seen the Ten Commandments? Great, I thought you would have. Well, certainly it's a classic. If you haven't seen the Ten Commandments, it's a little bit cheesy in play, so I have to say it, but arguably one of Cecil B. DeMille's greatest ever movies. And yeah, you should see the starring cast. Charlton Heston, Yul Brynner. I probably don't recognise. Oh, that's right. Eric Robinson, Edward G. Robinson. He was a bad character in many of the older movies, but certainly great thing. And for those of you who are a little bit more modern, we go CGI these days, don't we? So you've got Prince of Egypt, a more modern rendition. Now I want to go back to the Bible. I'm going to use the expression BCE. I'll explain for anyone who doesn't know it. We, in our Christian realm, typically talk about AD and BC, but outside of here, particularly in the Jewish faith, they don't like to be reminded that AD and BCE actually point to a particular person 2,000 years ago. So they use the CE for Common Era and BC before Common Era. They don't want to acknowledge who the C stands for. So about that time, Jacob and his Semitic clan of about 70 descendants migrate from Canaan to Egypt to escape a famine. They're initially welcomed and settle in northeast Egypt, an area called Goshen, and rapidly increase in number. Just a reminder what we have here. This is an outline, it's a satellite photograph with current geographical borders on. That represents the border of Egypt between Israel. You have Goshen over here on the eastern part of the Nile Delta. Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, they tend to have different names. Gulf of Suez, Gulf of Aqaba, and the Red Sea. Red Sea does extend up there. And we're going to talk about the land of Canaan, also the land of Midian in due course. And Jacob and his clan moved from Canaan down to Goshen. A new Egyptian pharaoh expresses alarm at these foreigners, how topical, and sets them to work as slaves on building projects. After 200 years, a Hebrew boy is adopted into the Egyptian royal household and by the Pharaoh's sister and is given the name Moses. Now, just a reminder, as we're starting to show some indication, the word Tutmosis goes one of the Egyptian pharaohs. You can clearly find that out in any writings of his history. Moses has the same root name. It means son. And I have to acknowledge that you'll see, very grateful that the Ten Commandments has been put into quite a few graphics from it are scattered on the internet, so it was good to get them to illustrate these. At the age of 40, Moses investigates his Hebrew roots, then kills a slave master. When it is known, Moses flees to Midian. Where is Midian? I showed it to you before. It's in southwest Arabia. Goshen, or from that part of Egypt, across there. Now I'm just going to briefly allude to what happens next, because this is one of the, I think it's probably a relatively trivial part of the dispute, but we do have some debate on where some of the things happened that we're going to talk about. After 40 years, Exodus 3:1 states that Moses took his flock to the far side of the desert. Remember, he's in Midian, he goes to the far side of the desert. There Yahweh revealed himself in a burning bush. Charlton Heston, burning bush. Yahweh, the pronunciation of his revelation, that's the revelation he has at that point as he's kneeling and seeing the burning bush, calls Moses to lead the Hebrews back to Canaan, and the Hebrews will worship him on this mountain at the place that Charlton Heston has that revelation. Deuteronomy indicates the law was given at Horeb. 1 Kings 19 recalls that Elijah flees Jezebel to Horeb, the mountain of God. In Galatians 4:25, Paul says that Sinai is in Arabia, and Exodus 19 says the Ten Commandments were given at Mount Sinai. So we have this juxtaposition of Horeb and Mount Sinai. Are they the same place? Well, I think they are. I don't think it excludes or in any way greatly affects the account of the Exodus, but there is this dual use of those two names. Right. About 1600 years ago, a pilgrim decided that that was the traditional site of Mount Sinai. And to this day, you can go to that monastery at the foot of this mountain here and say you've been to Mount Sinai where the Ten Commandments are given. But we've already read on the previous slide that Moses took his flock across the desert, which is about there, to a mountain the other side of the desert. And at least there are some commentators who would dispute the pilgrim who said it was there and said, no, it should be there. And there are other reasons as well. There is a volcanic region over here, and indeed some watered regions here, whereas there isn't much water and there's no volcano there. And as for those of you who might remember, I'm not going to go too much into it, there is lots of fire and smoke and stuff in the account of Exodus. So in my mind at least, I think that sounds more logical. Moses returns to Egypt and demands that Pharaoh let the Hebrew slaves go to worship, do a journey to worship Yahweh. Charlton Heston as Moses, Yul Brynner as Pharaoh. Pharaoh refuses, so at Yahweh's command, Moses calls down 10 plagues on Egypt. The first one, this is a take from the film, you see blood starting to spread over the Nile. Yep, lots of frogs. Then flies and locusts. And I'm skipping a few here now. The second last one is darkness. It's obviously from a classic painting by someone. And then before the 10th one comes, the Jews are told to go and kill a lamb and put blood over their doorposts, the top and the side. Very symbolic to those of us who are Christians, because we know of someone else's blood who's significant for our protection. And then the death angel comes through and all the firstborn are killed. And again, extract from the Ten Commandments, Yul Brynner, his son lying at the death god. That so frightened the Egyptians that Pharaoh orders the Hebrews to leave. And time-wise, we note that 1 Kings records that Solomon built his temple 480 years after Exodus, and we believe that Solomon reigned at about that, so we can roughly say that Exodus happened about 1440 BCE. But then Pharaoh changes his mind and pursues. The Hebrews escape through the Red Sea after it's parted by the wind. And when Pharaoh's army follows, the Red Sea closes over them, and Pharaoh and his army drown. Again, spectacular images. I suspect this is artistic licence by Cecil B. DeMille. I don't think the water really looked like that, but that was Cecil B. DeMille. Another point that is somewhat in dispute, again, doesn't really bother me that much, is where did they cross the Red Sea? If they went to the traditional Mount Sinai, then arguably in a direct line they would have crossed, I think, the Bitter Lakes. They're probably relatively shallow things. Yeah, you might argue that, with a strong wind it might dry up and you might be able to get through, and the Pharaohs following might break through the crust of the mud or whatever and stall, and the water comes back and it might drown. So conceivably that's possibly a true account on what our understanding might be. However, if in fact Mount Horeb is there and they're heading that way, there is another reason perhaps. This is the Egyptian Empire here. Why would you stay in the Egyptian Empire? You'd want to get out of there. And in fact there was a trade route that they followed over here to the top of the Gulf of Aqaba, which logically they could have followed to get out of Egypt. We then read that they turned back once they got to a certain point, a name we don't recognise, and waited till the Egyptians caught up and then crossed over that part of what's the Red Sea. And indeed, the name, the Reed Sea or the Rush Sea, I forget the correct Hebrew pronunciation, is actually more aligned to the name of that part of the Red Sea. So arguably that is probably or possibly more accurate. But problem there, that's very deep. God would have really had to do a real miracle to get them across there. But remember, this is the Rift Valley here, Dead Sea, as we already heard, lowest point on Earth, above sea level. And so this whole thing is a big crack in the Earth's crust. So that all might have changed since 3,500 years or 3,400 years ago. So things could have changed here. Maybe it was shallower back then.
There is one point there where it is a lot shallower.
I looked on the maps, all I could find, the topographic or the nautical charts, and I can't see any shallow pit. I have heard that theory. I could not find it. Unfortunately, we do have some Christian myths that go out there, and I'm not sure that I could see a point where it really was that shallow. I mean, there were parts of it, I think, on the eastern side, they were quite relatively shallow, but there was always a big trench right down the western side there. So I will leave that open to speculation. Of course, when they get to Horeb, then we have the Ten Commandments, the most majestic things. And look, it did my heart good to read them again. Yes, I know we're not governed by the law but grace, but to read the Ten Commandments again, I challenge you there, if you've not read them recently, please do so. They bring out God's righteousness, and they give a sense of what is really right about the way we should go. So look, I commend you to read them again if you've not done so recently. Having received the covenant at Horeb, the Jews make their way to the border of Canaan. They send spies, most of them who report that Canaan has too many foes, and they go away. Yahweh condemns them for their lack of faith, and for 40 years they wander around the desert before he's ready to let them in again. After all those who lack faith die, then he commands them to cross into Jordan into Canaan via the Jordan River. They conquer Jericho as their very first conquest in Canaan. That's Jericho. Again, Alex and Jeff, you've been there? Okay. Just a reminder, this is the old ruins, the tell, if you like, that represents the old ruins of Jericho. That is the new Jericho, where Herod built his palace, because that's where he had his winter palace. We are now down at about the level of the Dead Sea. The Jordan's down about here, and the Dead Sea's over about there somewhere. These heights here, Jerusalem's up the top where this is the desert or the wilderness where Jesus was tempted for 40 days and 40 nights. Small comment here, I don't want to get too off the track, but some people say the New Testament contradicts itself when it says, because one part says that Jesus healed a blind man as he was coming into Jericho, the other part, another gospel says, no, it says there that he did it as he was leaving Jericho. Well, right before your eyes, you can see why the two are consistent. That's Jericho and that's Jericho. One account saying he was leaving Jericho, the other one saying as he was entering Jericho. It's quite plausible once you look at that photo. Okay, they then make their way, this is just actually capturing that. This is the summary of what we've just told you about. They stop at Kadesh, pressed it too much. Wasn't very good. They stop at Kadesh Barnea, which is probably in that region, and then send out the spies. Then spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness before coming across the Jordan at that point just north of the Dead Sea. They then capture Jericho in a battle, Bethel and Hatzor. They're just three of the towns. There are other towns and other battles you can read about, but I don't want to go on too long here. So that now summarises what I had to tell you about the story of Exodus as we read about it in the Bible. Now let's go on and look against and for the account of Exodus. There is no Egyptian written record of Hebrew slaves, of Moses and Pharaoh and his army drowned in the sea. And of course you would like to record that your army just got defeated and your king was killed, but there is no record that it happened. Probably more aligned is the fact, if you go back to 1440 BC in terms of our classical history in Egyptian history, then certainly there's a strong pharaoh there. There's no indication that the pharaonic line got interrupted at all. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit in with the history that is classically believed to be part of the pharaohs and indeed the dynasties that we know of Egypt. So can't possibly, it certainly does not fit in. And again, sparse archaeological evidence of a conquest of Canaan at about that time or shortly after that time when they would have been in there. And let's face it, the 10 plagues, the escape across the Red Sea are very fanciful, and surely thus they are mythical. Like a number of other nations, they made up their own national myths. It's not that far off some of the other national myths we know of about that time. It was probably composed about 600 BC in conjunction with their Babylonian exile to give them a national myth, a national story to tell so that they could unite themselves. So, evidence for the Exodus. Now this is where I'm certainly not going to speak on my behalf. I am, though, using, it's a website, it's an Israeli website, that does debate various topics, and I'm quoting Joshua Berman, Professor of Bible at Bar Ilan University, certainly one of the more reputable universities, if not certainly right up there in terms of universities in Israel. No, it is true, we do not hear that there were Hebrew slaves in Egypt. The Egyptians do not refer to them. However, they do refer to West Semitic slaves simply as Asiatics, with no distinction among the groups. Just as slave holders in the New World never said, I've got a Ghanaian slave, I've got a Nigerian slave, I've got someone from Chad. No, they were all Negroes. We didn't distinguish where they came from. Didn't bother us. They were our slaves. We didn't bother about their geographical origins. So, yeah, no, the Egyptians didn't bother. They just said they were Asiatics. So there's nothing wrong with saying, well, we didn't say Hebrews. Well, no, they didn't, but neither did we in more recent history about other peoples. There is rich evidence that the West Semitic populations lived in the Nile Delta near Goshen for most of the second millennium. Some were slaves, some were raised in Pharaoh's court, and some, like Moses, bore Egyptian names. So certainly the context of what we read in Exodus is borne out by what we see there. Some personal names given to people out of the book of Exodus are very Egyptian. Not only that, and I've named them there, they were names used only in the second millennium. So how could someone in 600 BCE know all this about Egypt, say 800 years earlier, and get the names right? It doesn't make sense. The great Pharaoh Ramses II built a huge administrative centre out of mud brick in an area where large Semitic populations had lived, a place called Pi-Ramses. And Exodus 1:11 specifically says that they built Pithon and Ramses, very much like that name that we already know from history of the site was then abandoned 2 centuries later. In other words, after Ramses, well, I think we talk about 1300, 1200 BCE, it was abandoned, so someone writing it in 600 BCE, how would they have known about this? Exodus knew about it. In the Bible Exodus account, pharaohs are simply called Pharaoh, whereas in later biblical passages, I think we have to go certainly into the later part of Kings, we actually have a name attached to the word Pharaoh. This too echoes the usage in Egypt itself, where from the middle of the second millennium until the 10th century, in other words, roughly the time that we might claim the Exodus really happened, title Pharaoh is used alone. So again, why would someone in about 600 BCE know about that? Names of various national entities mentioned in the Song of the Sea. There's a praise when the Pharaoh's army is drowned. There's a song sung, and different different nationalities are mentioned. All of those were known about in Egyptian records at the time. Archaeologists have documented hundreds of new settlements in the land of Israel from the late 13th and 12th centuries BCE, congruent with when we hear that the Hebrews moved into Canaan. Here's a good one. We all know about Jews and pigs. Strikingly, these settlements feature an absence of pig bones. Sorry, we obviously stereotype Jews by their distaste for pigs, as indeed Arabs as well. It's not just them, but certainly interesting small point on the evidence that we see there before us. Major destruction is found at a number of places, in particular mutilated cultic statues. Now, for those of you who know, read the Moses' instructions, or God's instructions through Moses, they were not to worship the gods of the nations in Canaan. Certainly there was great destruction of mutilated statues in those cities. That's the town of Hatzor. You, Alex, been to Hatzor or near there? Okay, what about you? Okay. I did stay at, there's a kibbutz down here, Ayelet HaShahar, I think it's called, and it's this is Sea Galilee's here. This is the road up to Kiryat Shemona and Mount Hermon in the north. So we're looking south at this stage, but that's Hatzor there. Okay, the earliest mention of Israel is found in an inscription on an Egyptian stele, and it's mentioned in the context of being a people group, not a nation, not an existing, but a people group. So it tends to suggest that this pharaoh knew that there was a people group of that name. Again, this is way back more than of the order of 1100, 1200 BCE. And finally, is scant archaeological evidence relevant anyway? Again, the professor reminds us, for those of us with a British heritage, you go back and we believe in the Anglo-Saxon conquest, we believe in the Arab conquest of Palestine, even the Norman invasion. We all learned about it in our school books, well, I did anyway. Perhaps I'm showing my age. We accept them, but there's very little archaeology. If you would go and dig in these places, you could not actually prove much that happened, but we all know it happened because we were taught it. So we've got to be consistent here. If we believe that things were written down, that we accept in terms of British history, or indeed history of Palestine in more recent times, well, let's just use the same level of evidence.
So where's that quote from?
Okay, this is that's correct. Yes.
The only reason I ask is because my understanding of English history is plenty of Norman relics.
Norman relics. Okay.
And Norman culture, Norman buildings, Norman archaeology.
Yes. No. We're talking about then, but do you know when it happened? Do you know when it happened? I'm not saying that Normans didn't, but this is, did you know when it happened? Can you go to the Battle of Hastings and see the evidence for it? I don't think if you dig up at the Battle of Hastings.
1066,
Yep, you can see castles built there. And I don't deny, but trying to date it, and remember what the confusion, what the evidence against the Exodus is. We still know evidence it happened in 1440 BC. There's nothing there for it. But I'm trying to say is that you cannot actually date the Norman invasion that accurately except by a written record.
So,
Please do that.
So my cousins live in
Yeah.
And the whole of Hastings is all 1066 country, and they delight in showing you all the evidence. So I'm just wondering about...
Look, I'm only quoting it here, and please look it up. But I would suspect if you were to go, and I know the hill there, trying to think of the name of the hill, but there's not that much evidence of a battle actually taking place there. I mean, you go to the battles, you go to the, I was going to go to the World War I battlefields, but these today, of course, all you see is fields there. And yet, 100 years ago, there were people, huge stuff. So, archaeologically, things change, and you don't see much remnant once fields have been ploughed and stuff like that. But please, check it. That's where I got that from. I would suggest probably that one might be a little bit problematic, but I would think the Anglo-Saxon, again, we know the Vikings came in, we know they raided, but then they went straight through and were on their way and went back to Norway or Denmark or wherever they came from. They didn't leave much behind. They took it all with them. But of course, we do have this record. I thought I'd better throw that up. We do have a written record, the Bayeux Tapestry. Everyone know what that is? Anyone not know what it is? Okay. Big record of William the Conqueror's. And yes, we do have a big record, just as we have the biblical records of what went on before. Now, I'm going to go to the timing, because the timing is certainly one of the ways that the account of Exodus is shot down. Almost all of the Near Eastern historic timing is based on the pharaoh list of a guy called Manetho, an Egyptian priest who's commissioned by probably the second of the Greek rulers of Egypt, about 240 BC. That's what we're told. Now, I say possibly because historic methods seem so good, he quotes so many sources that he's so much better than earlier Greek historians like Herodotus. Some say it was so good it matches the later, more accurate Roman style of gathering history. But there are no copies of the original volume. What we know of is reconstructed from references. First reference from Josephus, about 80 AD. Then it's quoted by Christian historians, Africanus, and then Eusebius, about 100 years later. And they're approximate figures. You may be able to correct me on that one. I just wanted to make... But again, no original copies. And if we believe these, what was taken as references by those three historians, then we had the ancient Egypt prior to the dynasties, about the first and second dynasties, founded by a guy called Meni, which possibly is the same guy that's mentioned right back in Genesis chapter 10, I think it is. And we see fragments of agriculture, stone monuments and pottery, not much there. Then the Old Kingdom, third to the sixth dynasties, approximately 2700 to 2160 BCE, where the pyramids and the Sphinx were built. Proverbs were written and pharaohs started to dominate the regions around. And that's, of course, what the Sphinx looks like with the big Cheops pyramid in the background. That all happened back around that era then, if we're to believe Manetho's timing. Then there was an intermediate period where central power collapsed and local warlords competed for power. The Middle Kingdom, 2100 through to about 1786, pharaohs established central authority. Again, maybe I'm showing my bias towards the Bible, but we read about a similar account as Joseph as Prime Minister when there was a great drought. He was able to, in fact, he'd saved up a lot of produce during the earlier years. Then, when he sold back the produce to the starving people, he ended up collecting lots of land and brought all the power back to the pharaoh. Then there was a second intermediate period. Approximately those dates there. Central power collapses again and invaded and ruled by an Asiatic group called the Hyksos. Now, one might speculate, but if the dates are out, that was when Pharaoh and his armies drowned in the sea. But it doesn't match 1440 BC. New Kingdom, 18th, 20th centuries, approximately 1550 through 1069. You can see the names of the pharaohs there, the great pharaohs, Tutmosis and Ramses, I've already mentioned. And it claims that Ramses claimed to have conquered the Hittites in Turkey about 1270 BCE. Then there was a third intermediate period which goes all the way through to modern time, to the Romans, the Greeks, etc., where there are one or two strong pharaohs, but basically they were in decline and they were ruled by other nations. Now let's look at the Bible, which is contradicted by we can say that from the Dead Sea Scrolls, that we have a record that is largely accurate in certainly significant parts. It goes back 2200 years. We can go back and check the original sources 2200 years. There is no such independent check on the copies of the Manetho's scripts. That's where the Dead Sea Scrolls are found. Whilst the copies of Egypt appear to show accurate listing of pharaohs, both Josephus and Eusebius translations infer that some of the dynasties occurred in parallel. But all the interpretation has been that they occurred one after the other. Two of the guys that read the book say, look, there were times when they were ruling together. You've got Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. There were times, conceivably, when Egypt was weak, when you may have had two pharaohs ruling at the same time. If in fact you had parallel pharaohs, then we can compress Egyptian history as currently interpreted. Not all in series, but some of them in parallel. According to Orthodox Egyptian timing, Ramses II, as I say, claims to have wiped out the Hittites about 1270 BC, whereas both the Bible, but also, let's not believe the Bible, also Egyptian records show that the Hittites were a strong nation around about 800 BCE. So you've not only got the Bible contradicting Egyptian history, you've also got the Assyrian history contradicting. Now, I've got to be careful here. I don't want to denigrate Manetho because Manetho may have been misquoted. Our interpretation of what we know of Manetho is contradicted by both the Bible and by Assyrian records. If the Orthodox Pharaoh timeline is incorrect, the attempts to contradict biblical timing of the Exodus events by Orthodox Egyptian history may be false. Okay, folks, 10 Commandments, just on 8 o'clock. I caught up a lot of time. I hope I didn't rush too much. Thank you very much.
Questions that I'd like to address to Steve?
I have a few questions.
Yep.
Yeah, sure. So in your biblical account of the Exodus, what literary genre did your passages fall under? What would literary genre be?
So I just need to understand the literary genre because you're talking about which translation or
History
No.
of Apocalypse.
Well, like there's historical texts, being like this is definitely talking about history, or I mean fantasy. There's all kinds of genres, right, of literature. So,
Yeah.
what literary genre, in your opinion, do these texts fall under?
I believe they are historic. As I read the book of Exodus, it's written as an account of something that happens. It talks about the family of Moses. It talks about how his birth, and then of course it gets fairly dramatic and perhaps fanciful when we talk about the plagues. Some of them sound, they talk about magic, the Egyptian turning the snakes back into rods just as he could. But I think it's largely historic. In fact, from about mid-Exodus through parts, it actually becomes a suzerainty, a treaty between a god and its nation. It's written in the form of the Hittite treaty with their gods, and so in many respects it has a form of a treaty as well as a historic context to it. So I certainly think it's written like that. Let's face it, we live in a different age, and what history was written like then and what form of literature was written like then may not match what we now accept that sort of form of literature should be written like today.
So you take a straightforward sense.
No, I do. I do.
That of course doesn't mean one way or the other whether it's true or not. It means that it was written so it was supposed to be accepted as history.
Yeah.
Let's follow up with a question. The scope of your Exodus account included Joshua
Yes.
as the Exodus. Is that normal for
Well-
scholarship to include Joshua? That seems...
I
Because
take
you'd
your
think
point.
that once you leave Pharaoh's realm of influence, the Exodus is over. That's leaving the country, right?
I take your point, the literal term Exodus today,
Okay.
except that one of the contradictions thrown at one of the criticisms of the evidence of the Exodus is there is no evidence of the occupation of Canaan, I'll use the word Canaan rather than Palestine or Israel, at the time purportedly that follows on from it. So you've got to say that the occupation of Canaan was a sequel that indeed is criticised as one of the reasons the Exodus did not happen. So I'm perhaps extend a little bit, but only to counter the criticism that there is no evidence of occupation of Canaan at the time purported at the end of Exodus.
And you're
Because the
criticising them on the
alternate
basis
theory.
of the Mononethos king list.
Yes, well that's true too.
Yes. The alternate theory is that Israelites were just part of the Canaanite culture and they formed their own group from within it. So they didn't come from outside, but they actually developed from within.
So does that answer your question, John?
Yeah, I just wanted you to comment on why you included
Yes,
Joshua
and
as part of the
it's
Exodus.
a good question. It's a good question. Thank you.
One of the things that kind of impresses me, like the alternate theory is that, or the books of Moses were actually written after the exile, around in the 500s BC, to give the nation a national identity. But why would you bother including all the detail that's there, like about the tabernacle and all the detail about how it was constructed? Because the tabernacle was gone by that time, and so why would you bother having all that high level of detail for an event that occurred 800 years before?
You did not mention Josephus' record. Would you consider his stuff as mostly based on the biblical record anyway, or would he have had other sources?
I don't know enough about Josephus, so I'll defer to anyone else that might care to answer that question.
My understanding is that he based all his history on the Old Testament.
I do know that he had some other details that are not in the Bible,
Yeah, he had his own genealogy.
and a few other things as well.
But
Yeah.
he did quote from Matthew as well, because he not only wrote about the Jewish history, but he also, of course, extended it to other historians, and that's where he got at least some of his background information was from that from Egyptian priest Matthew, who has now become, if you like, the quoted authority on Egyptian and indeed Near Eastern history. Or the interpretation of him. Again, I don't want to criticise him, because it's the interpretation of what he wrote that has been purported, is now regarded as being fixed in stone. This is the way things happen.
Well, I understand there's quite a bit of archaeological evidence in Israel that dates back to that era,
Yes.
the era of the Israelite conquest of the land.
Yes.
And more is being discovered and understood all the time. But I understand that, for example, like this, I think it's Hatzor
Yes.
and Ai and others, where it records in the book of Joshua how there were significant battles at these places, and that the site was given over to destruction, often completely burnt. That there is evidence of those things from about that very time period to show that there was a massive destruction of some of these particular cities. And there's also evidence about Jericho. I've been to that mound in Jericho, and it's not very exciting, I'll have to admit.
It's a mound.
Yeah, there's a lot of dirt, but there are a great many layers, and some people with expertise have been delving through those layers and working some things out. But it's supposed to have been a continuously inhabited city, they say, for 10,000 years. So there's a great deal of stuff there, and you can see evidence of certain things, even catastrophic things that have happened in that time period when there's a discontinuity in the record. What were walls once have obviously been completely obliterated and scattered, and then another wall starts, things like that. So archaeologists are able to sort of trace out or work out some time periods and where it might correlate with the Bible record. One other thing, I've also been, when I was in Israel last, I was in Jerusalem. Like, I've only been in Israel once. I mean, when I was in Israel last year, I was in Jerusalem. I spent a day at the Israel Museum, which is the national museum in Jerusalem. It's a wonderful place. You could spend a lot longer than a day there, someone like me. But there was a whole section, I think it was a special exhibition, but it was to do with the Egyptian it's to do with archaeological evidence of the Egyptian presence in Canaan from about before the purported time of Moses. And they have dug up quite significant things. There's all bits and pieces, but there's also quite significant monuments and I don't know, inscriptions and things like that. I can't remember now what they said, but there definitely is solid evidence that the Egyptians had influence or even rule in what was Canaan then, between the time of Abraham and the time of Moses. It came and went a bit. They had some reverses, but there's quite a lot of archaeological evidence about all that too. And really, because the Jewish people themselves have a great interest in history and archaeology, they've got their own desire to establish their links to the place, but they have great evidence, they have great interest in it, and a lot of scholarship there too, which is ongoing. So they are finding out more and more things all the time.
Thank you.
I'm interested in some of the Christian things, some of the things I've found up around the Sea of Galilee that go back to the time of Christ, Jewish synagogue at Magdala, and considerable relics at Bethsaida. Capernaum it is, and then there's Bethsaida around further. There's an amazing amount of stuff.
Oh, yes.
it might be pretty hard to work it all out, and I'm sure there are controversies between experts. There always are, aren't there? You know, two experts have two different opinions. There's a lot of stuff there.
Oh yes. It's just to look across from the Mount of Olives to see the wall of Jerusalem. Now, Italy was only built, I think, 600 years ago by Solomon the Magnificent, but just to see a walled city, to see the Dome of the Rock, yes, a beautiful structure, that gold dome. But to know that that was the place that Jesus wept over, that site. It was the site that Abraham came, first sacrificed Isaac. How many years ago was that? 4,000 years ago, perhaps? A very special place to look on. Especially a place to look upon, because if we do believe in some of the writings in the New Testament, it's where it's future in the Old Testament, it's where the centre of the world will be in future times, where the last great battle will be fought, not just at Armageddon, but around in the valley of Gehenna and Kidron, right there at the foot of Mount of Olives. We live in a far-flung place over here in Australia, but that's where the centre of the world is. And we sometimes got to remember that's where it's all going to happen.
Yeah. But I think when we come to consider archaeological evidence and what various scholars say about this and that, and especially when it's to do with lack of evidence, supposed lack of evidence, we have to be very cautious, I think. And can I just give an illustration of that? I went up to Nazareth, of course, and spent a few nights there, and that was really interesting. It's a huge town, actually, much bigger. You know, everything's much bigger than I thought it would be over there. But Nazareth is a big city these days, mainly Arab city. There is a Jewish city called Nazareth Ilit, which means Upper Nazareth, because they're up on top of the hill, and the old city of Nazareth is down here. But some people say, the Bible's all fictitious because Nazareth never existed in Jesus' day. There's no evidence to say that it was there 2,000 years ago, and so it's all made up, all that stuff about Nazareth. Well, in actual fact, there's a lot of archaeology going on in Nazareth too, and some things they found are just after that period, but they have found this very significant Roman bath that does date to 2,000 years ago, or even a little earlier. It's one of the biggest Roman baths that there is, and it's quite a story as to how this was found by this shopkeeper who was renovating a shop. Found these unusual clay pipes low down in the wall. They found a double layer of clay pipes and joints in it, and the more he dug around and scratched around, and he's just an ordinary person, this guy. He wanted to renovate his shop so he could sell more stuff. And then they got underneath the floor and found all the area where the fires were made to keep the air to pass down through passages and up into these rooms associated with the bath. And they found a huge Roman bath there that dates to 2000 BC. It may be one of the biggest in the world, this Roman bath. And it's quite amazing. I went in it. I've seen the things that were there to see. It's quite a story as to how it was gradually understood what it was and been identified. And I went down underneath. I've seen it. It's quite amazing. So there's evidence that there was something there in Roman times, 2,000 years ago, quite significant. There must have been something in the town as well. And there's other things too, I can say.
They've also uncovered a house as well.
Yeah, there's an ancient synagogue that maybe just after that time, said to be the one where Jesus would have preached. That you may not be able to say that for sure, but it's certainly very old. But there's other things I have found not far from the Basilica of the
Church of the Annunciation.
Just underneath the Church of the Annunciation.
Exactly.
There's a lot of stuff there I've seen. I couldn't work out what was what, but it's very ancient, and all the experts are trying to work out what's what. There's a heap to go through. And another church just round the corner from that, and another place. So, all the stuff there is so much being found and continuing to be continuously. So you have to keep particularly critical views. You have to hold them cautiously because, or sceptically, because there's more and more evidence being dug up all the time.
So one of the features of we get external records outside the Bible about various kings in Israel. So we get information prior to the exile about various kings of Judah and Israel. And the kind of, as further you go back, the less information you get.
That's true.
And it stops at around about David. So David was disputed as whether he even existed, but we do have some references to David. But beyond that, no records about Saul or Samuel or any of the judges. So you naturally expect the evidence to decline the further you go back. And then as soon as it stops, then the skeptics jump in and say it never happened. But what is it? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
That's true too. That's very true.
Yeah.
Note that one of the quotes, if I may, was that the Hebrew people were recognised by one of the Egyptian pharaohs. It's very, very minor reference to it. The fact is the Hebrews were recognised as being in the land of Canaan as a people group about the time they were supposed to have exited out of Egypt. So
I thought it was around about 1200.
Yeah, something like that, yeah. But by that stage they'd established themselves.
I think that also may be in this Israel Museum too in Jerusalem.
Yes.
We'll go back there again, I'll have a closer look at it.
We've got the scroll book, the scroll book, the big.
That's right, that's there.
Thing with some of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
The 2,000-year-old complete record of Isaiah, for example, is there, and lots of other stuff.
Tom?
So two comments and a question, if I can. So the first comment is that the first time I heard about the lack of archaeological evidence was actually on a Veritas forum. I don't know whether that was presumably post-2001. I don't know when...
Look, there is no doubt, in fact, the very opening statement, there's a big schism in Judaism at the moment between those who are pragmatic, believe that there isn't sound evidence and say, well, really, we've got to be honest, there's no real strong evidence there, guys, and that's caused a big earthquake in Judaism. In fact, that particular preface I was quoting actually starts with that thing and said, that has caused a major earthquake in Judaism that exists to today. It was a very dramatic event in Judaism that rabbi started in Los Angeles. And you're right, there is those who will definitely say that.
And I must admit, so this discussion still hasn't actually convinced me, and I'm just, because after that, and certainly one of the reasons I was interested in talking tonight was because that's unusual in our archaeological reference. If the event was so large, now maybe the event wasn't as large, and maybe the people group wasn't as large. I mean, let's face it, we didn't have 6 billion people on the planet back then. And maybe we'll still find stuff, but I still. So my first comment is the comments about the archaeological evidence is still open questions in my mind. That leaves me a little uneasy, and also because of what it has done to Judaism, and that works into their secular Jew versus non-secular Jew. There's that whole thing, right? The second comment is actually one thing that you brought up was really, really important. That really gelled with me was the fact that the Egyptian records didn't show the defeat of their army, etc. And let me add weight to that. Having come back from Tokyo in November last year, it was amazing, this big gap in their history. And most of you know my job's based out of California, so Alex, I'm hoping at this point you're Canadian, but I don't think so. But no, seriously, one of the things that always comes up, and it's a bit of a joke at work, right? And this is to add weight to what you were saying about the history. This really resonated with me, and I hope these comments will actually amplify that. One of the jokes comes, oh yeah, the convicts on the line. Going, well, hang on guys, hang on. many years ago, when I was living in the UK, we went to the Emigration Museum at Portsmouth in England, south of London. And this Emigration Museum in Portland, Portsmouth, basically shows the Thames full of all these prisoner barges that could no longer be sent to the New World, could no longer be sent to the US.
The hulks, yeah.
And so what it points out is the fact that the US was also founded in significant part by convicts.
Yes.
Now this is part of the English history. It is most definitely not part of the US history that I've ever uncovered.
True.
So that really, those two stories really amplify and really make true the fact that the histories between one country and another will vary drastically.
Well, history's always written by the victor.
Yeah, it really does. It really does amplify that. So that was actually that point was really quite reassuring.
Thank you, Tom.
And the question is really the open question about the archaeological evidence.
Look,
why did that hit you? Does that not leave you with an uncomfortable feeling that we shouldn't have found more?
No, look, I'm sorry, I don't know if I close it up, but there is evidence. There is archaeological evidence of Asiatics in the Goshen area, in the area of Goshen. That's what. Look, this is what the professor says. I have not delved there. I've not been to Goshen. I cannot tell you that for sure. But Goshen, that part of Egypt where the Bible says they settled, has got evidence of groups of foreigners working there, both as slaves, but not necessarily Hebrews. I'll say. But again, I'll just use that illusion. The fact that yes, we know all about the Negro slaves that were brought to the New World. Most of us don't know which part of Africa they came from. That they were just Negroes or African American.
That's a good point, and that hit home too. That's really valid. But you would think archaeological and artefacts and things, you would find 40 years of a large people group roaming the desert, and as I could find out, there is almost zero evidence of a people group of a Hebrew people group roaming the desert. And that's the open
what would you
question.
expect to find?
Yeah.
What would you expect to find? Because you think about it all, usually archaeological evidence is usually in cities where there's been a population there for thousands of years. Right? But if they're just wandering, they're not going to leave a lot of evidence. Especially only over 40 years.
It's supposed to be millions.
We're talking 1 million people. It's not just 2 or 3. We're talking a group of 1 million people approximately.
Yeah, but they're on the move for 40 years.
They're moving. They've still got to have fires. They've still got to have pots, pans.
Do we know that it was 1 million people? That's the question.
There are good questions.
It doesn't fit the sort of like 40 odd people coming, and then suddenly there are 1 million people. So
it is theoretically possible on a population basis for there to have been that many.
Yeah.
But there are also other good reasons to consider that the interpretation that we have may not be quite correct.
There's a book in the Bible called Numbers. That's right. All right, and it has numbers in it.
Yes.
And so
100,000 men.
Yeah, and some of the problem with numbers, but like the number of firstborn sons, it seems too low in proportion to the rest of the population.
Mm-hmm.
But that's where they kind of get the figures, like they say around 600. What? How many?
600,000.
Yes, 600,000 counted for military service or something like that.
Yeah, and so if you. So they didn't count women and children. So just multiplying it by a ratio, they figure that it's probably 2 million if the 600,000 men figure is correct.
So if there was 2 million of them, how many millions of people how many millions of Canaanites and Hittites and...
Yeah.
There must have been 10 million people. That's a huge population.
Yes, particularly for
I believe that the population around that time of the world was only 20 million people or something.
Exactly. I suspect there may be an interpretation error, a mistranslation of that.
Oh, well, in battles, those when people say they can kill 10,000, you know that's an exaggeration. So that's accepted often. But I do question the 1 million people. It doesn't seem real.
Don't get me wrong, my favourite scenario.
Because I could just say Jericho, look at the size of it.
But I do think it is a blocker, And I think it's a really good question.
But we do read that, I mean, it seems that they only stayed at Mount Horeb, which we don't know where it is, by the way, for any particular long time. After that, they moved, and we do read that there was a cloud that hovered over the tabernacle, and when it rose, they left and went, and then it hovered, and sometimes they were there, it appears, for quite a number of days. We just don't know. But they were on a camping trip. So when you pull up your tent pegs, you only leave a bit of hole in the ground, and then you're on again. Yes, you deposit bits.
Not when your entire generation was wiped out. You leave burial.
So that's the population of Adelaide moving.
You leave bones. You leave burial. Fossils. You leave those sorts of things.
But there's been in South and Central America whole civilizations that have vanished completely. Completely. There's no evidence of them apart from what somebody has said.
Yeah, and I'm not saying we won't. Just my question was
it's a good question
about the weight that you sort of skipped over it, and that to me was the weighty part of the question.
Okay. For 40 years, they went between Egypt and Canaan. We know they stopped. I forget how long did. I think it was about a year they stopped at Mount Horeb. I think
Something like that.
And so yes, wherever Mount Horeb is, you would expect to see something significant there. Oh, I'd agree. But I think the jury's still out. Where is that place? Thereafter, they would move for a number of days at one spot, on again, a number of days at one spot, on again. Kadesh Barnea, we don't know precisely where that is. It's somewhere in the desert-like region down south in the Negev. Yes, you would expect there would be, but we don't again know precisely where that is. And thereafter, we know they went up the Kings, after that generation died out, they went up, they went up the King's Highway, which fairly historically well known route up following the Jordan, or the Araba, the Rift Valley, north before they turned left and went to... But look, I tell you, I did read one thing that I didn't bring out here. There's mention of, is it Balaam, the guy that the king of Moab brought to curse them? There is found in modern day Jordan some writing on a wall somewhere, which is the dirge of Balaam, lamenting his passing. So here we have a mention of Balaam. The only other references we know of is there in the book of, I think it's Numbers, is it?
It is Numbers.
Numbers. And suddenly here, on a wall, completely divorced from the Bible, is this right, and apparently as far as they can, they are dating it back to about that time. And maybe it's a bit almost like it's a bit like finding out Homer's description of the Iliad. But there's this myth, this ballad about Balaam. And then we have this corresponding, hey, Balaam, we read about it in the Bible. You know, somewhere out of the blue, there's this reference to Balaam. Oh, yes, a Homer Iliad type thing, but nevertheless a reference to a character that is very much part of the aftermath of the Exodus. And so, yeah, chunks, not the whole lot, but it's a bit like joining dots. No, I cannot give you a solid line, but I can give you a few dots along the way that match the account.
I really like the point about your question. I really like the point about the destruction, the archaeological destruction and stuff in and around Jericho and the rest of Canaan. I thought that was a good data point to actually imply that there had been a takeover. Not that might be unusual.
No.
Look, I encourage anyone, obviously in an hour, and indeed, I probably only spent 20 or 30 hours preparing this. I'm by no means an expert. Going over and over. Please visit that website if you want to go into more detail. This is the argument within Judaism at the moment, and I'm sure you'll see counter-arguments on the opposite side, but if you want to find out more, please, I encourage you to do so. And that website was the one that I chose to use, and I'm sure there are others. But obviously there is a big debate going on in Judaism at the moment, and that is one website that I've found. I'm sure there are others that will give you a lot more detail from people just as distinguished as this professor.
When it comes to the archaeological evidence, a lot of that comes down to what Stephen was saying about the king lists by Manetho and the interpretation of those king lists. And so if the timeline is actually a lot shorter because you've got parallel kings in Upper and Lower Egypt, then that changes the whole dating of everything. At the moment, historians date everything in that period of history according to that king list. And so therefore they pick a particular time, then they date the New Testament a certain number of years back to there and it doesn't match up. So therefore there's nothing happened around about that time, so therefore it's all wrong. But there was something happened around about this time. And if you adjust the king list, if the interpretation of Manetho's writings was incorrect, then it all comes back and you do actually have lineups, hence some of the other items that Stephen mentioned.
What was so incompatible about the king list at the time of Moses?
Okay, if we take the Bible account from when Solomon built the temple, then we date the Exodus about 1440 BC. You would expect to see dramatic events in Egypt like collapse of society and some vacant, but
Change in dynasty.
But if you change in dynasty, a king that had no son, for instance, because he was killed. We do not see that if we use Manetho's or the interpretation of Manetho with a serial set of pharaohs, one after the other. We actually, first of all, we certainly go back before the flood account. One believes the flood happened at about 2400 BC. Also, we see a very strong Egypt at 1440 BC, one that has no indication of any tragedy or anything like that. You actually have to say, you would actually think it would have to be one of those intermediate periods between strong kingdoms that's where it happened. And you have to translate Egyptian history if you receive it. And as I say, speculation, admittedly, from a biblical point of view, but also supported by Assyrian history, is that the timeline, if you just use serial pharaohs, then you're not matching the Hittite, the account of the Hittite Empire.
Yeah, because the Assyrian records contradict the Egyptian as well, don't they?
Yes, they actually have a list of Hittite kings that the Assyrian king corresponded with, and this was an Assyrian king, which we can put place around about 800 BC, and he certainly could list the Hittite kings that were in power and appeared to be quite established, and that was happening in 800 BC, and yet Ramses II is supposed to severely conquer the Hittites about 1200 BC, and classic history, based on classic Egyptian history, says, the Hittite Empire died out around about 1200 BC.
But that's assuming that it didn't rise again.
But the Egyptians themselves never record the Hittites again. And yet the Assyrians were recording them quite strongly.
That's what I mean, but perhaps their influence wasn't as strong.
Perhaps
their
not.
border moved backwards. So there's lots of other explanations.
Well, there are.
All you know is you don't know.
Well, yes and no. No, you're right. I'll accept that. Yeah. But it's certainly, and let's face it, I'm going to be quite blunt here, and it's human nature that a pharaoh will often boast about his victories and will hide his defeats.
Of course.
As we all do. Victor's right.
So, but I still don't see that empires come and go, and that area is actually, a huge area where the major empires met, really.
Well, that's right.
And it was where a lot of trade and all the rest of it went. So those people would have been conquered backwards and forwards. They would have got a bit sick of it, I think.
They would have, but I would have thought that
the Jews.
The Hittites would have. We know that there's an account in the Bible where somewhere the northern tribes are fearing a Hittite. I can hear the Hittites coming, and it's as though it was well known the Hittites were a strong power around. This was probably about 900 or 800 BC. Certainly, the biblical account, it's not.
I'm not disputing that. I'm just saying maybe we're not referring to the same Hittite empire that they were referring to, because after all, there's been a few Persian empires too. They've come and gone.
True. Look,
so
I'll leave that there, but it's certainly.
Haven't they found a lot of Roman artefacts, like in the sea? Like if the sea opened up and these people went through,
yes.
Isn't it? I've heard a lot of information, saying that they've found a lot of Roman artefacts within this sea where, if they were drowned, if they had swords and shields and chariots, a lot of these Egyptians have been found.
I have not seen that. Look, I think this professor, who's obviously keen to defend the account of the Exodus, certainly focused, as a professor living in that area of the world, focused on the evidence that he thought was convincing, and he didn't mention that. So I'm actually assuming that a guy who's needing to maintain his academic reputation would only quote those things that he felt were real and strong. And honestly, again, as I pointed out, the crossing point of the Red Sea is open to dispute. Yes, maybe they did cross through just the Salt Lake, or did they cross what's called the Gulf of Aqaba? Don't know. I think it's the Gulf of Aqaba, but I could be wrong.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm just curious, what philosophical framework are we using for explanations? Is it inference to the best explanation, or what are you using?
Pass.
Yeah.
Call a friend.
Yeah, I'd have to say, and look, I'm actually owning as a mouthpiece for this professor, who is a professor of the Bible. Yes, therefore, he's probably got a bias to using the Bible as his trusted source for what he's reading, but at the same time, he's used outside sources as an academic of some esteem or reputation should use to verify his belief system by quoting evidence outside there that he believes he could trust in. Because if he quotes anything that is inaccurate, then his reputation is shot. And again, please read. I'd invite you to look at that website if you wish, because I think you'll see corresponding arguments going on around that.
We're not that rigorous that we define our formal methods.
Okay. Yeah, I thought what you did up front, and I thought you were giving me an apologetic.
Yes.
I actually think an apologetic is actually the answer to your question. Because, the lack of evidence not being evidence of lack or evidence of absence, I don't know if that implies that the biblical account is the best explanation without the rest of the theology and world history. If you just take just this, maybe you wouldn't account.
We had a little discussion about what is an apologetic approach, and I think we kind of walked away a little from saying that we only want to give the apologist side of the argument and not give much weight for the counter-argument, because it's actually more credible if you give the counter-argument full weight, so that you actually know that you've taken it into account.
Look, I'm just thinking of other big people groups that emerged. You think of the groups that eventually caused the destruction of Rome. You had the Goths, the Vandals, and other people groups moving out of Asia across the steppes across Europe before descending on Rome. And they would have been of the same magnitude as the Exodus. Bigger, probably. I don't know there's that much archaeological evidence of them moving across Asia. We know they were there, we've got the written records, but I don't know you could go and dig a hole in the ground and say, that's where they were, or whatever. That's right. Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting question. I will take that away and actually research that, because I don't know if we do it. Of course, it's much more recent, so maybe it'll be hard to compare. Mm. But you've just raised an interesting question, because we say that there's not, but maybe there is.
There's plenty of evidence that, I've been to Ravenna, which the Visigoths were Christians, and they, built, extended the church, put paintings there before the Romans tried to liberate the fact they'd been there. So and they were so-called barbarians, but they weren't.
Once they settled in a place, absolutely.
No, but they were Germanic. They weren't, like you said, Asiatic. So. I think the Asiatic invasion is later than what you're trying to say.
It's hard to compare those dates. So you're going back another 1,000
years. You're talking 300
AD
or later.
Okay,
I think we better call it quits at this stage.